All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our dance college, this nice facility. And on behalf of Eastern New Mexico University and Academic Affairs, this afternoon's faculty lectureship will be provided by a set of faculty from the College of Education. Now, I usually introduce them. Their slide has done all the work for me. These four individuals are outstanding in their field, and in the faculty lectureship, it's about celebrating scholarship and research. So it's an opportunity for us to listen, learn, and ask questions. That's the whole point. And again, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce these individuals. Dr. Patrone is the lead, I understand, on this, but Dr. Betterly, Wagner, and Dr. Evans are all faculty whose credentials speak for themselves in terms of education administration and secondary education and educational foundations, I understand, too, as well. So I'm ready to learn, and I hope the rest of you are as well. A reminder, if you haven't already, please turn your phone off, or at least dim the audio so it doesn't interrupt anything. And would you please help me welcome our speakers today.
Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. Thanks again to Academic Affairs for inviting us to speak today in the lectureship. So to give you a background on this, within the bigger picture of teacher shortages in the nation and teacher shortages in the state of New Mexico, we decided to look closer at existing teachers and what motivated them and what inspired them to become teachers. And that became the focal point of our study, which we ran last fall. And ultimately, we were able to get in over 24 New Mexico school districts. And we administered a 35-question Likert survey instrument to eventually what became 615 existing K-12 teachers by the time we shut down the tool. So we got a good amount of data. And again, we wanted to look at what inspired these individuals to become teachers, and then find out if they were in fact inspiring their own students to at least explore teaching as a profession. We were really curious about what was going on in the classroom. So essentially that's the synopsis from which we derived our data from. And I will turn it over to Dr. Wagner for what were the main research questions we asked within that study.
Okay, so our research questions were what inspires an individual to become a teacher. We also looked at how educators inspire their students to become a teacher, and what is the relationship between being inspired to teach and inspiring others to teach, and then what is the relationship between an educator's view of the profession and inspiration. Our investigation really began in why teachers were there, what was causing them to be there, and what can we do to maybe systematize something to where we can encourage just basically, you hear grow your own, and every time I hear grow your own, it was always reactive instead of proactive, instead of looking into our own institutions and thinking, how can we cultivate the new generation, the next generation of educators in our school systems?
So we looked at different types of literature in the field that we were going to dive into. And obviously there's a lot of intrinsic and extrinsic influences on what motivates one to enter the teaching profession, and the literature bears that out. Specifically, we wanted to drill down on what, if any, influence current teachers have on their students to possibly to consider the teaching profession. Again, we looked at quite a bit of literature, and there's a plethora of motivating factors that inspire somebody to go into the teaching profession. And again, we decided to focus in on the influence of active teachers on their students in the study.
So, as Dr. Patron pointed out, well, maybe he didn't mention it, but the sample size was 615, so we were actually able to get a pretty good sample size, which we were kind of surprised because in doing research with districts, sometimes it can be extremely difficult to get access to teachers. Generally, emails get sent through the district. They kind of leave it up to the district to disseminate, and that doesn't always go really well. So thankfully, Dr. Patron just kept emailing and emailing, and I should talk about that a little in the next slide. But we did get that sample size up. We were aiming for a minimum of 200 because, following, I guess, some of the work of Merkler is really to make accurate inferences with a sample that 200 is kind of that minimum point where you can say, yes, these inferences can mean something for an entire population. So surprisingly, again, we got 615. We were excited about that. So we developed a 35 item Likert survey. I won't go through all the questions, but really the survey, the instrument was designed to directly assess the 4 research questions that Dr. Wagner shared with you. So, looking at the statistics, we really focused obviously on central tendencies and standard deviations, but we also wanted to try to do some statistical analysis, and we used bivariate correlation analysis. We wanted to understand what are some of the relationships between the factors that inspire a teacher versus them inspiring other teachers. So we were looking for those relationships. We also use chi-squared test because it's a more appropriate test with nominal data, and then we use the correlation on the ordinal data. So that's kind of our approach. Surprisingly, a lot of some of our most impactful data was in some surprising places, as we're going to point out. But we won't get too much into the details of the statistical analysis, although if you have questions later, I'll be happy to answer them. I brought my stack of papers. But that's just the general overview of kind of what we did.
We were very excited to find these pieces of data that jumped right out. 99.19% of our students, our teachers, believe that teaching plays a vital role in our nation's future. We were so thankful to see that when we thought everyone will say that. So potentially there's one person who messed the scale up, and we kept all 615 of their scores in there, but Mrs. Crabapple does exist, and she may think that she doesn't play a part in the nation's future, but we're very excited that 99.19% of us believe that we do play a role in our nation's future. We also believe that as teachers that we're role models for the profession, and that they were proud to be teachers, and we were excited to see that 96% of them were there, and that they were proud of being a teacher. That was something that was also really great to see, and that 94% of our believed that the profession was a professional occupation and not just a job, and that was a great thing to see. And nearly 80% of them believed that it warranted the same status as fields such as medical and law professions as well. So that was great, and these were the things that we could see. We could pick those right out, and they were very high scoring in all of the questions that were asked. Our next slide will show what one of our questions looked like. This was, I was encouraged by a teacher to become a teacher, and 6 out of 10 of our respondents were encouraged to become a teacher. That's a beautiful piece of data to see. But our next slide will show this inspired our next questions, because that one piece of data, we can't really ask, answer anything from it, except that they said they were encouraged by a teacher to become a teacher. So our questions become, how, in what ways did a teacher encourage you to become into the profession? That's what we would want to know. We would sit down with a focus group and ask them that. What are you talking about when you say you were encouraged to be a teacher? Was it because you listened to Doc Elder on the radio on the way to school and you said, no, I want to be that guy? Or was it because you had a teacher that put their hand on the shoulder and told you, hey, you have what it takes to lead a classroom, and you are really gifted in this particular subject, and you should be leading others? That's what we don't know. So that's one of the things that was brought up by our questions that were out there. And so we want to get to that heart of that. What was the relationship between the respondent and the teacher? Was it that they had a direct connection, were they told, hey, you should be there? Or was it because they just watched and observed? And then why do the respondents believe that they were encouraged to be a teacher to enter the profession? Those are questions that we were left after looking at all of the data. And it was really an eye-opening piece. After we got the data, we were excited, and then we had to have our statistician tell us, well, you can't make those differences. We were disappointed in that. So thank you, Jason, and we'll move forward. So, but that was our first jump out there with the questions, and that's what the questions look like, and some of our inspired questions that came from our research.
And there were additional questions that stood out to us, and again, the whole premise for this presentation was what further questions did we see from this? And as you can see, one of the questions that was asked of the teachers, do you initiate positive conversations about the teaching profession with your students? And 73.97% of the respondents said they did, which was obviously got our attention, and it spurs additional questions. And so what we wanted to know further, and again, in focus groups, wherever we could get this information, but what are the topics of the positive conversations you're having with your students when it comes to this teaching as a profession? When do you have those conversations? Are they during class? Are they after school? Before school? What's the context in which those conversations take place? And what are the reasons why teachers will not initiate positive conversations about the teaching profession with their students? These are questions that we would like to ask and find out more and dig deeper. Again, this is data that's from specific questions that really stood out to us.
As an elementary principal and teacher, I really was excited about this question about elementary teachers should encourage teachers or encourage students to be teachers. And we found that it was right about half, 56% of them felt that they should be encouraging teachers to become teachers. I was a little taken aback when I saw that, because I thought, well, what happened to the whole, what do you want to be when you grow up question that you put out there? I guess we're still asking it, but we're not saying that you should be a teacher is the follow-up piece to that. And so with the data point, we can't really ask and answer that question, but we can say our teachers are encouraging, but not to the level that we would like to be filling all of the empty vacancies in our schools right now. But, so that follows up with our next inspired questions of how and what ways can an elementary teacher be supported in encouraging their students to become a teacher? And it's a long way from the fourth grade classroom as a student to the university and becoming that. So we were wondering about, what do those connections look like? What does it look like for someone who wants to be an elementary teacher, and why do they really believe in their heart that that's the job they want, to make that jump in the university and begin taking those courses? And then we were wondering why 38% of our staff disagreed with that statement that elementary people should be encouraging their students to become a teacher. We wondered, was it because they felt negatively towards the profession? Was it because they felt that you can't make that assessment early? You don't want to stifle someone's career or their aspirations for life. And so we will never know unless we dig a little deeper, but then that's the inspired question portion of it. What's the role that an elementary teacher plays in recruiting others to the profession? I know personally, I came to the university with the idea of being a high school teacher, and it was a university professor that encouraged me to go into elementary course. Then she jumped ships and goes to secondary, but that's the way it goes. I guess she was filling an opening for herself. But I was inspired by a university professor to go into elementary, and so I was really excited to see what our data was fleshing out for us. And this has been really a great project, an honor.
Speaking of secondary education, when we looked at the data, we looked at how the majority of the respondents felt like it was secondary teachers' responsibility to encourage their students to go into the field. And I know this is a time where students are, investigating a little bit more seriously about what they want to be when they grow up. But that whole idea of growing our own needs to start very early, not be reactive, but proactive in the earlier grades. So we can look at this that, we have 19% of them strongly agree. I don't know about the strongly disagree. I'd really like to sit down with those teachers and say, what's going on in your life? What's wrong? So there are a lot of things to fix, but, hopefully just look really into the positive. So let's look at some of those questions that we can look at. So again, why are they more accountable for recruiting students to the teaching profession? There should be an accountability for all of us, seeing, who has those gifts to be able to work with the next group of P12 students. And how can school districts create a proactive system for encouraging students to become teachers? We currently have many different ways. I don't know. I became a teacher because I was in home economics many years ago, and I got to go teach a kindergarten class. And to go into a class and to teach kindergartners about primary and secondary colors and mix water together, and they were like, oh my goodness. It was like I was a rock star. It was so exciting, and I got to experience that when I was a senior in high school. And that made me decide that I wanted to be a teacher because I thought all of my efforts made another human being's life exciting for that moment. And I wanted to do that with my life. And if we could institute systems within our school district, what type of systems can we do? Right now, we're working with Educator Rising. It's an organization. It's sort of like Educator Rising is to educational FFAs to agriculture. It's a class that high school students take to learn about the teaching profession. So what type of other programs can be instituted that could successfully mentor those students to become a teacher?
So additionally, we asked the question, do you actively encourage your students to become a teacher? And this is another question that stood out to us because it kind of contradicts the earlier question where they said 70-something% initiate positive discussions about teaching, yet 62.17% of the respondents do not actively encourage their students to become teachers. So again, that inspired us to look at what further questions can we ask and what's causing them to not actively encourage their students to become teachers. We want to know, is there anything specific that makes them or gives them hesitant to encourage teaching as a career path? Or what kinds of career paths are you encouraging if you are encouraging students in the classroom to follow? And what kind of changes in education would the respondents like to see so they could encourage their students to become the teachers? So if there's something systemic that could be adopted to at least alleviate any hesitancy to encourage students to pursue teaching as a profession.
So 12% of our respondents discouraged their students from becoming a teacher. This was heartbreaking to look at. But without further information, it's difficult to say, well, did they misscore the question? Or was it that they're saying, oh, we think that you have such higher aspirations, we don't want you to become a teacher and to settle for this career of changing people's lives. But the truth is, we really don't know why they were discouraging. And like Dr. Wagner said, we would really like to sit down with those teachers and say, well, why are you actively discouraging? You strongly disagree with it, or you strongly agree with discouraging your students. There's 18 teachers that are in our surveys amongst our ranks that are saying, I actively discourage my teachers. Now, that could potentially be a lot of different reasons, and so we would really like to dig down and find out in there what the reasons were. And our inspired questions were, while many respondents do not discourage their students from becoming a teacher, what causes them to not actively encourage it? Is it that we don't have the tools, that we don't sit down and say we have a program that we'd like you to do it, or that they haven't been given permission? And that was one of the things that I thought of as an administrator. Are we giving our teachers permission to say, hey, seek out our next generation, seek out the next leaders in our school and tell them what to do, and say, hey, you've got a great shot at this life of luxury that we get to be in school. But you get to inspire the youth of our next generation, and it is a great gift. And so we need to be able to have that conversation. And I wondered, as a school administrator, are we not giving them permission to do that? And that's something that I took away from that question, is how do we have professional development that encourages teachers to build the next generation? And that's what we're about.
Future research. Dr. Evanek and I are currently engaged in a research project. We're investigating our undergraduates here on campus. In 2116, that's Structured Observations in Teaching and Learning, they do an assignment. It's a teaching rationale. It's just a paper on what are the people and events that inspired you to investigate this profession and become a teacher. And so we're looking at that to give us some ideas and just basically share their voices of what got them here, and to celebrate that and to get that out there and let school districts know that your students came to us with these ideas. These are the people that empower them and encourage them to become a teacher, and these are the events that happen, so that we can just keep those, institute more of those within our district.
And two-pronged research pieces that are coming out of the graduate school are, one, we have interns that are doing their administrative internship, and we're wanting to use the same survey instrument with them to ask, well, what's making you choose to leave the classroom to go into administration? Why would you leave teaching to go to the dark side? For Star Wars reference. But ultimately, we want to know those people that are at the pinnacle of education, why are they choosing to leave the classroom to go into administration and leadership? Is it one of the reasons that we've seen here, or is it we would like to get focused with it? That also spurred on with Dr. Patron that the research that's saying that we have a large number of principals that are leaving the field, and so we were wanting to know, is that connected with why they initially got into education, and now are they leaving for what reasons?
Yeah, it's a study that we're going to take on that's spurred on by a 2022 report from the National Association of Secondary School Principals nationwide survey that said 40% of all current school principals will be leaving their position within the next 3 years. So that got my attention when I read the article, and being a former high school principal and knowing Matt, Dr. Beverly is a former elementary school principal, I knew he would be real interested in that article, and I sent it to him, and we kind of had a discussion after reading the articles that, there's a study here that we can pursue. Because the impact on education could be extremely profound. So we're going to focus on to see if that 40% figure, which is a nationwide number, if that applies to the state of New Mexico. If we have a correlation where it's, potentially 40% of New Mexico principals are planning on leaving, that's going to have a profound impact on our school systems, and I think our school systems have been through quite a bit, especially recently. So losing their principals will likely have a somewhat impact on education going forward. So that's what's spurring our future plans for research. And we have reached the end. Great timing.
Yeah, it's great timing. Go ahead. Questions?
Questions?
So What was your sample in terms of, were they all from New Mexico?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all New Mexico. Do you have any idea whether they were from large school districts, small school districts?
Part of our instrument was the demographic information, and Jason could pull up the exact questions, but we found that there was a good balance of the respondents came from small rural up to urban. It took, I could spend a whole nother lecture on the problem of access, especially to the larger districts, but we did ultimately get into Albuquerque Public Schools, Santa Fe Public Schools, and also Rio Rancho, albeit with tremendous amount of bureaucracy to go through. But again, the access to more rural districts was a lot simpler in that it was a conversation with the superintendent. Yeah, sure, I'll distribute this at my next staff meeting, or have the principals distribute it. Up to Albuquerque, where you have to go through the multiple layers of bureaucracy and research review boards and getting approval at different levels. So, yeah, we had a nice balance of rural up through urban districts.
And also elementary and secondary.
Yes.
So we had good representation. Also, we looked at the amount of years teaching. So we had people that were novice teachers to veterans, and it was really nice to see the.
Yeah, I think actually the majority, and Jason could give you the statistics, but I think majority that answered the respondents had over 16 years of teaching under their belt. But we got a really nice sample size, I think, in a lot of the demographic questions that we asked.
And that was good. I don't think there's any way that you could separate it out, but that would be the obvious question is, the longer you've been or the more invested you are, the newer you are, the more discouraged you are. But I imagine you probably can't separate that.
Well, we were able to do that a little bit. For instance, one that was surprising to me is the higher education levels did not associate with more actively encouraging students. I mean, there was a tad higher, but nothing statistically significant, even close to statistically significant. It was very, very little. So we did also see that, and that was another surprise. We didn't see that the longer that the time that they've been in the classroom had much of an impact on levels of inspiration. I mean, that kind of presents more questions in and of itself to unpack.
We had often wondered if because the longer you were in the field, the more you forgot why you got into it. And there was a little bit of that piece, but of course, our data's not going to flesh that out for us. But that would be a follow-up question we wanted to know. Was if you've been in the field for 16 years, do you remember that elementary teacher that inspired you to do it? One of the things that we thought really neat was our question about had you had opportunities to teach and expanded that out. And we wondered about relationships too. Was outside of teachers that you could have coaches that we didn't include that may not have been explicitly spelled out in there? Was it a Sunday school teacher, or was it a basketball coach that was in your youth program, or was it, where was it along the way that inspired you? So we didn't necessarily have the specific title of teacher of science or of fifth grade or whatever, but maybe it was somebody that you watched on TV that you felt like was a teacher that inspired you to do it. So there was a lot more questions than answers.
No, it's something connected to that. One of our questions was if the teachers had been given leadership opportunities, and we gave some examples in the question. Sunday school teacher was one, or taking part in tutoring. We talked about church leadership opportunities, some things along those lines. And there was a strong relationship between students that had been given opportunities to lead versus a strong relationship between if they've been given opportunity to lead and their teachers.
I've been around a lot of outstanding teachers, and I don't recall ever hearing one say, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, you can be just like me when you grow up. I think there's a hesitancy for people that, are good teachers that inspire, tell jokes and stories like a good friend Doc Elder. It just comes naturally. On the other hand, mediocre teachers, the poor teachers, and I see a lot of math people in this category. You stand there and say, you can be just like me, and everybody would go, yuck. So I think,
I think that goes back to what Dr. Betterly was talking about in professional development, actually articulating how do we encourage a student to become a teacher. If you see another student helping another child or being able to explain something, just even the kind words of saying, you explain that very well, you might consider being a teacher someday. And really focusing, I think, instead of focus on ourselves, more about seeing those skills, seeing those assets in students and acknowledging them. But, how are teachers taught that? So I think that's a professional development that's not discussed. Yeah.
And you think about how many kids in an elementary school think they're going to become a professional athlete. You could go out and say, how many of you are going to be a pro athlete? And the majority of the class would raise their hand. But if you said, no one's asking them, how many of you would like to be a teacher? And that's the part that really stuck in my heart. If we could find, even with a young teacher, to say, hey, you can do better than I do, then that was one of the pieces of data that I think we should have shared, was that people didn't go into the profession for negative reasons. And there was a whole lot of thought that there might be some of the, I'm going to prove my teacher wrong, and that's why I'm going to become a teacher. And that was not a factor that drew people to the profession. And that was a nice thing to see. So maybe even the young teacher could still inspire some folks to get in if they were just to say, hey, you can do better, or let's give them a shot. And I think that's one of the things that we really talked about in our findings, was that maybe if we had developed some kind of professional development went into the schools and said, hey, as a staff, you would take 3 minutes to tell people, hey, this is a great profession and something to think about in the future for you as a student, you could be that. So we need mediocre teachers too.
And this awareness is so very important. Years ago, I had a teacher candidate who was out in the field. She was in the public school during her field experience, and she came back to me and she said, Dr. Wagner, my cooperating teacher, every time we have a passing period, he says to me, do not become a teacher. And he's discouraging from doing this, from me doing this. And I immediately got on my phone and I texted a friend who had it, and I said, go to her class, because I know she'll encourage you. And that was something that I could not fathom, somebody discouraging a teacher candidate from entering the field, and that's what they're studying at the university level. So we knew that things have to change.
Yes, along those lines, if I got this correctly, so you show a 96.2% in the declining perception of the profession, something like that. So is that
Not declining, I think,
the perception of
that's
the
96.2% are concerned.
They're concerned
They're
about.
concerned, yes.
It's a public perception. They're concerned about.
Yes.
So given that, obviously that perception, that's quite a huge challenge to that we, I think, experience in our own ways. But my question to along those lines goes to what do you know what fields were this teachers teaching, and is there a gap also in terms of the rural and the urban data set? For instance, math teachers are
Pertaining to that exact question, well, I imagine if it were 96.2%, that it's going to be pretty. Now I don't have that off. I'd have to go back and look at that. But it would have to be pretty consistent across the board to have that high of a percentage among 615. So I mean, it might be the difference between 91 and 97 and 89. So I imagine with that high of a level, it's pretty consistent.
I'm wondering how social media impacts the career, vocational, occupational impact or thinking of the current generation. They're on those phones, they're seeing TikTok, they're on YouTube, they're seeing other jobs other than teacher. Maybe that's stronger than the impact of the teacher in front of them.
As educators, we do a horrible job of telling our positive stories. We allow negative images all over the internet to reflect our profession. If you, the videos of school fights, or the disrespect of the classroom teacher, or the negative perception of parents and teachers and those kind of things is detrimental to encouraging people to join the profession. That's, I think, a lot to go with that question that you were asking back there, that there is so much negative social media attached to our profession that you would think that it was a dangerous and difficult job to go to, and the impact on us recruiting people to come to it, or to continue to say, come to, hey, you should be a teacher, is definitely there. But we didn't directly ask about a social media question, but I would say we have definitely not told our positive stories of the great things and the great impacts that happen and the miracles that happen in our schools every single day to impact children, to impact families, and to grow our communities. We do not do a good job of telling the story.
Well, and then look at what can the teacher control?
Mhm.
Their live experiences in the classroom is what they can control. They can't control social media.
Right.
So, those experiences and those day-to-day interactions in the classroom with students are going to have to combat the negative social media that's out there and the perceptions that are out there that draw negativity to the profession. So it's another burden for the teacher to combat. But again, it's going back what Dr. Wagner was saying about the mediocre teachers and things like that. There are opportunities that arise in the classroom, and as a teacher, you have to just recognize those opportunities. I was a secondary high school social science teacher for several years before I went to the dark side. And there were many opportunities where, students, you had a particularly challenging day with some classroom management issues, and then you had some of your better students who come up to you at the end of class and say, I don't know how you do this. And then there's your opening. Well, this is why I do this, because I love what I do. And then you get the dialogue going as far as, yes, this was a challenging situation and we were dealing with it, but here's why I'm still in the profession, I'm still doing the job. Or, you give tutor responsibilities to some of your students, and you're walking around with their tutors, and you see students who are just doing an amazing job of tutoring. And, you pull that kid aside afterwards and say, you're a natural teacher. And, the aha moment where I never really thought about that. Well, you're a natural. But does every teacher do that? Not necessarily. You have to be able to recognize your openings and then, take advantage of those.
You have to have that placed in your mind in order to do that, and that's where professional development comes in. I have a research question to educators is, do you believe that education is the most important profession? And teacher candidates are very hesitant to say yes. They'll say, I think it's one of the most important professions. Or it's very important, but they're very hesitant to say it's the most important profession, and that's what you need to say. Because even Ted Cruz had teachers.
Oh. We're not going there.
We have a question in the back.
Sorry about that.
Not a question, really, just a suggestion in terms of how you intend to move forward with your focus groups and so on. And as a management professional, I want to say that understanding employee engagement as a concept is important. And if you do not examine employee engagement for everyone, and you find yourself, whether you go over to the dark side or not, having issues with attrition. Because if people are not engaged, then they're actively looking for ways to get out. And so perhaps you ought to use employee engagement as one of your variables, to look at what you're doing there. And if you're going to do that, I would really like to be on a study like that, because employee engagement is my thing. Right? So, I think that is important. And I also found something else I wanted to read because it brought it back to me when I said that a second ago, and I had it here, and then this is from Adam Grant, and we may or may not know Adam Grant, who is a Wharton professor. And he says, and this was just a couple of days ago, November 8th, what do you want to be when you grow up sends the wrong message about work. We should teach kids that who you are is more important than what job you do. Work is an activity. It doesn't have to define your identity. A healthy sense of self is rooted in character, not in career choice. So I thought it out, because we're laughing about it and so on, but we may not think of how deeply rooted asking a question like that could be. So,
Thank you for sharing.
you're welcome.
I've got two questions. The first one, based on the literature review, did your patterns mimic what you expected on a national basis? In other words, what you expected in terms of the responses? Did that literature review tell you that you would get something, and were you able to compare that?
Well, most of the lit review that we looked at, they were looking at different types of intrinsic and extrinsic motivations for wanting to become a teacher. One study focused primarily on family influence, on, I have an uncle who's a teacher or a father who's a teacher. That had a significant impact in that particular study. But then there were other extrinsic factors involved in some of the literature where people had positive interactions with teachers or leaders, coaches, football coaches, and sport coaches that inspire people to want to teach. Our study focused specifically on the impact of school teachers on inspiring others to teach. But there's all kinds of different, the literature shows there's all kinds of other inspirational factors that motivate one to become a teacher.
And to follow up, did you find any real differences? And I know it's getting into the data, but I really like the idea of the rural versus the more urban school districts, and whether you expected differences there and whether they showed up.
There were, one of the factors that we saw was there were fewer that had kind of a negative perception of education, or I guess were, what was the term, actively discouraging and actively encouraging, a little higher rates, nothing huge, but there were a little higher rates of actively encouraging the profession and a little lower rates of discouragement.
But that's just like the percentage. What about the variation? If you looked at the Likert scale, there's probably going to be some variation, between the two. And there might be a stronger variation in either the more rural districts versus the more city districts.
I think I ran those tests. You may have to give me a minute.
Oh, no.
And because I don't have it up here.
And an interesting thing, you have elementary versus secondary. Both of my kids went through the public system, and that really wasn't the defining moment for them was junior high, middle school, sort of in between the two. Is there any way to ferret out that crazy time that is there?
We did isolate that as one of our categories. When they had to classify themselves, we gave them the option of, was it the 6 to 8?
6 to 8.
We gave them the option of identifying that 6 to 8. Now, sometimes that gets complicated because you do have teachers that, in small districts particularly, that teach below and above that. But for the most part, that category would grab those features.
And one last thing, have you thought of actually asking the students how their perception is as to whether the teachers are encouraging them? In other words, I asked the teachers if they're encouraging, what do the students perceive?
That's kind of what we're doing with the
Okay.
students that come to us. You know, what are they telling us?
Yeah.
You know, did they actually get encouraged explicitly to say, or was it just, you know, vicariously, this teacher, I saw what they did and wanted to be like them? Amazing teacher.
That would be interesting to me, what their perception is.
Another question? Yes, sir.
I have a question about how do you collect those samples? Like, initially you say you collect like 600 some samples. I wonder what's the initial sample size required, like how many surveys are done? How do you collect those data?
So how did we actually
Yeah, how
collect
do
it?
you encourage those participants to like fill out the survey? You can post it. That's what we don't have anything.
Like I mentioned before, I could spend a whole other lecture on access and getting those results. When we started from the outset, we shot for 200 to be an ideal number. And we opened the tool, I think, when the beginning of the school year, and we initially had a period of time that we were going to leave it open for. And, you know, that's what we were articulating to all the school districts. And then I would get a report, and we used SurveyMonkey as our tool site. And we were getting them trickling in from the point of it being open, but when I started seeing or getting frustrated by the lack of surveys coming in, then I decided to do a little bit more prodding, if you will. And depending on the district, it was simply emailing the superintendent, hey, Dr. So-and-so, did you happen to distribute the link to the survey tool? And then the bigger districts, it was just, I knew that was going to come later because we had several layers of bureaucracy we had to go through. You know, the research review boards for some of these larger districts don't meet. You know, they only meet maybe once a month, so we knew that it was going to be a while before they were going to get on board. So we ended up extending the deadline of our tool, and then it was a period of October, I think, to November, where I was just emailing every day, just basically bothering that the people who control the ability to access and say, you know, we're still waiting, we're glad you're participating, but you know, when will it be distributed? And eventually we started, Albuquerque, I think, was the first one to say, hey, we approved you. Here's how we're going to distribute it. And then they would, and then all of a sudden, you started seeing more and more. Our rural districts and our suburban districts, they front-loaded the responses a lot more than the urban ones were at the tail end, because of the length of time it took to get approved. But again, I followed up, once we got the official notification from these research review boards that you are approved to distribute the survey, then I took it upon myself to personally email. I think I sent out 200 and something emails to different school principals within the districts with a copy of the approval of the research review board saying, hey, your district approved you taking a survey. We really want your participation. And it was just in a matter of 6-7 weeks, we started to get masses of responses over time. And then by the time we decided, okay, we're going to turn this tool off at this date, we had 615 teachers that responded.
And our list of districts came from, those were purposely chosen. We looked at districts that we had a partnership, where we had either student teachers or alternative licensed students or ed, interns, where we were working with that district. So that's where our list came from. What's ironic, after Dr. Petrone went through all of that, I mean, it was actually having to fill out another proposal per se in their format to be able to take it to their review board. These districts were like, okay, you went through all that trouble, now by the way, we want your results. So, it was encouraging. I mean, it was definitely worth it.
Well, oh, I'm sorry. It begs two questions. First of all, were you able to separate people that go through the teacher education program versus alternative licensure? And I gotta ask, was there any way to separate how many of these people were graduates of our program and how plugged in they were to education?
The teacher prep, we did separate that out. We had it how we went through. As far as our graduates, we did.
We just used our graduates as the specific districts we wanted to target were districts we already had an existing relationship with.
But in terms of the 615, you don't know if they were to Mexico State or UNM or Eastern.
No, we didn't ask them where they graduated.
I imagine our kids.
Oh, yes, sir.
Were much
Yes,
more.
sir. That was my speculation.
Any other questions? Let's thank our presenters one more time. There's refreshments, reception, and I also want to thank John Hauser, Comm Services, for the videography he's been doing. You can view this later on at your leisure. More questions while we eat. Let's go.